Comrade Prakash Karat, Comrade Bardhan, comrades and friends. It's a real privilege for me that I've been asked to deliver this lecture which commemorates the centenary of Comrade Jyoti Basu, who was not only an outstanding communist leader in the country, but around the turn of this century, in my view, there was no other communist leader anywhere in the world other than the Castro brothers who had as much mass popularity. It is in fact an intriguing question how a person who did not come from the rural background, did not come from a peasant background, in fact came from a highly westernized urban background, could actually relate so easily to the masses and acquire the stature of being an enormously popular mass leader. As a matter of fact, I recollect an occasion when, along with Dr. Ashok Mitra, I visited him at his home at a time when he had a cardiac problem and was living on the campus of the Calcutta Raj Bhavan. It was a social call, so we were looking at some pictures which were on the mantelpiece, and there was a photograph of a person, very fair complexioned person, who had a hat, who had shorts, and who had stockings. So I happened to ask Comrade Basu, is this some comrade from the British Communist Party? So he gave his suppressed smile, he said, my father. So a person from such a westernized background, and incidentally even his introduction to radical literature was something which was effected in this particular background. His uncle used to be a judge who was trying some of the terrorists of that time in East Bengal. Jyoti Babu used to, as a student, sometimes go and spend the summer vacation at his uncle's place, and in the afternoon, summer afternoons, nothing to do, he would start reading the literature that the terrorists had, which all had been collected and kept in the house of the judge for him to peruse. It was through reading that literature that he actually began to be influenced by those ideas. And so long before he went to London and came under the influence of Rajni Pamdar, he already had his kind of world view, more or less in an embryonic form, developed. The intriguing question, why such a person could acquire such enormous mass popularity, is something which, in my view, the answer to it lies in the fact that, he was a person who had no duplicity. He said what he thought, what he believed, and he lived up to his words. There was no duplicity, there was no doublespeak, there was no pretense, there was no timidity in whatever he was saying. And I think it is that which made people trust him. They could repose their trust in a man who was absolutely direct and straightforward. But what is remarkable about Jyoti Babu is that even these properties, these qualities, he would take almost as a matter of course. There was a time during the United Front government when Ajay Mukherjee was the Chief Minister of West Bengal and Jyoti Babu was the Deputy Chief Minister, that there was a big police mob which attacked the West Bengal Assembly. They had some demands which had not been met, and there was a police attack on the West Bengal Assembly. Every legislator, naturally, to defend himself or herself, just fled the assembly. But Jyoti Babu kept sitting in his room. And he was actually the Home Minister at that time, so the police ire was directed most against him. And when they came, firstly, to see this man who was completely unflappable, going on sitting in his room even when there's a mob attack, was itself something which was quite daunting. And then when he gave them a dressing down, they quietly went away. This was not, in my view, something which came to him as a way that he should tactically behave but rather I just think that is the way he thought any person should behave. In other words, there was a certain assumption that this is the way one behaves, and there is a certain natural way of behavior, and that includes simply doing your work even when there is a threat which arises because of an attack. Implicit in that also was a belief in the efficacy of rational discourse, and associated with it the fact that I hold my views because I believe they are right. There was a time, I remember, when I was the conference president of the Indian Society of Labour Economics, and Jyoti Basu came to inaugurate it. After the inaugural speech, as he was going back, getting into the car, we were accompanying him, he turned around to me and said, "Send a copy of this speech to Manmohan Singh." In other words, the assumption naturally was that you can engage people in a rational discourse and change their views. And therefore, if this speech, which was against introducing labour market flexibility, is something which is making a point, then naturally that should be sent to Manmohan Singh, and he's going to rethink his position. It is this belief in a rational discourse, the efficacy of rational discourse, the belief that there are ways in which you behave, which really you don't kind of work out tactically. That's just the way one should behave, is something that really marked him out. And associated with it was also the belief that if you're in a communist party, then automatically you tended to accept certain disciplines of the communist party. There's a story which I heard, many of you would have heard it, that during the BTR period in 1948 onwards, after the Second Congress in Calcutta, when the party was underground, Jyoti Basu and Indrajit Gupta were sharing a shelter. And of course, one day Indrajit Gupta would cook and Jyoti Basu would wash the dishes. The other day, it was the other way around. One day, Indrajit Gupta asked him, "Jyoti, how long is it going to continue?" So Jyoti Basu said, "As long as the wrong line of the party is not rectified." So he knew that the party was taking a wrong line, but of course, as a matter of course, you have decided to join the party, you have actually made a choice, and you go on, stick to that choice, and that's a way of living. And it was not something which is tactical, it's just a way of living. It's that which actually, in a sense, was felt by almost everybody who came in touch with him, and that aroused an enormous amount of respect for Jyoti Basu. He was not pretending, he was simply living a life which is, according to him, the natural thing for a person to do. The dignity of that life is something which he felt was natural for a person to imbibe. Now, it was a part of this belief in the efficacy of rational discourse that Jyoti Basu was very influenced by Joseph Stiglitz's book, Globalization and Its Discontents. So much so that again he asked Manmohan Singh during the period that Manmohan Singh was introducing the neoliberal reforms, "Have you read that book?" So that, the view was that his belief was, if Manmohan had read the book, then he wouldn't be doing what he's doing. It is apposite, therefore, that today, when we are talking about the centenary of Jyoti Basu, I should be talking of another book which has been as influential as Joseph Stiglitz's Globalization and Its Discontents, and that's the book by Thomas Piketty, Capital in the 21st Century. Piketty's book is an extraordinarily impressive empirical work which actually looks at the trends in income and wealth inequalities in a whole lot of countries over a period of 200 years. What is remarkable about the book also is that he uses tax data which have so far not been used. He uses tax data to come to these several very important conclusions. Taxes, income tax and wealth tax were introduced in much of the capitalist world in the more recent period, in the 20th century, in the 20s or thereabouts. But of course, in France, after the French Revolution, you had the introduction of a wealth tax. So the French data go back a very long way, particularly about wealth inequalities and all that he makes use of. Having used them, then he comes to the conclusion that there is, I mean, the central point is that there is a U-shaped curve, and that U-shaped curve is the following. That you have very high levels, even rising levels of inequalities in income and wealth until 1914. The period from 1914 to 1945 is a period when you have a real drop in the level of inequality of income and wealth. While after 1945, there is a gradual increase in inequality, but that gradual increase becomes very serious in the more recent period. Therefore, there is a kind of U, where the period 1914 to 45 represents, as it were, a trough when you are talking about inequalities in income and wealth. Why is this period 1914 to 45 so exceptional? He adduces a number of reasons. Firstly, of course, the very destruction which was wrought by the two world wars also meant a lot of destruction of wealth, a lot of destruction of buildings, property and so on, and therefore there was naturally a certain leveling that took place during that period. Then you had the expropriations or the kind of writing off of all kinds of debt, and therefore writing off of all kinds of property, which followed the Bolshevik Revolution and which also followed the period of decolonization. So of course I'm talking on 45, decolonization occurred thereafter, but it had the same impact of actually, in a sense, by wiping off property, it had the impact of reducing wealth inequalities. The introduction of taxation of income and wealth, which I said is something that particularly occurred in that period, was another major factor. And also what you had is that that was a period generally in which consumer goods prices went up faster than property or asset prices. And if consumer good prices go up faster, that means the level of income went up faster relative to wealth. There was therefore a decline in the wealth-income ratio, and every decline in the wealth-income ratio also entails a decline in the ratio between the income from wealth and the income from work. And that was another equalizing, or a factor for reducing inequality. So he adduces a whole set of special circumstances because of which he believes that this period was an exceptional period. But if you look at the more recent period, then wealth and income inequalities have been rising. Why are they rising? Why is it? And how do we prognosticate what is going to happen in the years to come? The central theoretical point he makes is the following, that basically there is a rate of return on capital or rate of return on wealth, and there is a rate of growth of the economy. If you have a big difference, if the rate of return on capital tends to be much higher than the rate of growth of the economy, then you have the wealth to income ratio rising, and if your wealth to income ratio rising, then of course the ratio of income from wealth to income from work also rising, and therefore not only income inequality is rising, but also wealth inequality is rising. Because some people, middle class people who get income from work as well as income from wealth, their income from work does not go up as fast as the income from wealth. Therefore the weighted average income they get doesn't go up as fast as that of the very rich, and consequently their savings, which constitute additions to wealth, don't go up as fast, and therefore wealth inequality tends to increase. So his argument is that really the crucial factor to look at is the difference between the rate of return on capital and the rate of growth of the economy, R minus G. Now, of course, it's true mathematically that if you maintain a given R minus G, then over a very long period of time, wealth and income inequalities may tend towards a certain kind of stability. But of course, before that very long period of time has come about, if you suddenly have an increase in R minus G, then once more your wealth inequalities would tend to rise. And his argument is that in the 21st century, we are going to have an increase in R minus G, where G is the rate of growth of income, and this rate of growth of income, according to him, is going to fall in the coming decades, not only in Europe and the advanced capitalist countries, but indeed in the world as a whole over a period of time, but Europe and the advanced capitalist countries almost immediately, because of the declining rates of population growth. The theory he accepts is one in which the rate of growth of income over any period of time is ultimately tethered to the rate of growth of the population. I should say that is tethered to the rate of growth of the labor force, plus of course the rate of growth of technological progress, that is labor saving. And suppose you have therefore a 2% growth rate of the labor force, and suppose you have a 2% growth rate of labor productivity, which basically means that each worker is becoming, as it were, 2% better, more efficient over time, then it's as if you have a 4% growth in the labor force in efficiency units. And of course, if that is the case, then ultimately your rate of growth of output or income is tethered to that 4%. And the view is that therefore, if you have a decline in the natural rate of population growth, then even though technological progress could, up to a point, offset the effect of this on the growth rate, ultimately the growth rates are going to come down. And if the growth rates are going to come down, then of course you'd find that wealth inequalities are going to increase. So the argument that contemporary capitalism is going to cause increased wealth inequalities is an argument which is put forward in a very strong and effective manner in Thomas Piketty's book. Now this argument, of course, has a very strong overlap with the Marxist position, which says that immanent in capitalism is a tendency towards an increase in wealth inequalities. That basically, over a period of time, wealth inequalities increase in a capitalist system. While he would not exactly argue that, but if we are looking at the period from today into the future, then what the Marxists would say and what Piketty would say more or less would coincide, namely that there is going to be an increase in the level of wealth inequalities. Now, of course, that's something which is an extremely important point, and the idea of bringing inequalities in income and wealth into the centrality of intellectual discourse in economics or social intellectual discourse is of great significance. John Maynard Keynes had once said that the ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are far more influential than is commonly supposed. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. As a matter of fact, once you appreciate the power of the ideas, the very fact that as opposed to the neoliberal ideas which have been holding sway in the recent past, the fact that now you have an alternative set of ideas being projected to center stage, a set of ideas which express concern about increasing inequalities, is in fact to be welcomed. And Piketty's argument is that an increase in wealth inequality is of course inimical to democracy. You cannot have democracy functioning if you have such increases in wealth inequalities which are taking place. Increase in wealth inequalities would also give rise to increases in income inequalities, and he argues that in the United States already now you have a situation where the top decile of the population controls 90% of the total income. Now that's an enormous inequality, and particularly in the context of the United States, which by the First World War was far more equal than Europe was, is now far more unequal than Europe is. And of course he argues that this is something, quite rightly, that this is something which is inimical to democracy. And consequently, the solution that he suggests is, of course, capital taxation. That basically there has to be a taxation of wealth. That if governments tax wealth, then that is something that can actually rectify to an extent this increase in inequality which is likely to arise in the coming years. Now, I think while a lot of these, I'll come to taxation of wealth later on, while a lot of these propositions, as I said, are propositions which are really common in a sense between a Marxist position and what Piketty is arguing, nonetheless it's very important to distinguish between the two. In fact, it's crucial to distinguish between the two because the theoretical basis of Piketty's argument is, in my view, completely wrong. In fact, it's based on a very discredited theory. Let me try and say why. Many of you who are not students of economics might have done in your PA past courses or even at school level something called the marginal productivity theory, which basically says that, look, ultimately distribution of income in society is determined by the fact that the markets the markets function in a way to ensure full employment of all factors of production. And if there is full employment of all factors of production in the market, then each factor of production gets what is called its full employment marginal product. Basically, that suppose there is full employment in the labor market, one more laborer comes along and says, I want a job. And if that laborer is employed and the addition to the product happens to be, let's say, 10 bushels of wheat, then the wage rate would be 10 bushels of wheat. If actually the addition is more than 10 bushels of wheat, then there will be more demand for labor, you can't have full employment. If the addition is less, there will be less demand for labor, you can't have full employment. Therefore, according to this view, there is always full employment in a capitalist economy in all markets, and of course the marginal product determines the factor shares. And from this it follows that if there is full employment in every period, then you take a sequence of periods, you look into the future, you look at the growth rate of the economy would nothing else be the growth rate of the labor force. Because ultimately, after all, if labor force is growing at 2%, then the economy can't grow at 10%. Labor force in efficiency units, economy can't grow very fast because naturally labor force has to be fully employed in every period. So this is the theory which economists refer to as neoclassical economics. Now, neoclassical economics is thoroughly discredited, not only because of the fact that, as Marx had shown over a century ago, that you cannot have a capitalist economy that can function at full employment. If a capitalist economy does not have a reserve army of labor, then not only is it the case that the surplus value becomes threatened, because if it doesn't have a reserve army of labor, then beating down the real wages of workers becomes that much more difficult, and consequently surplus value is something that cannot be sustained if you don't have a reserve army of labor. But what is more, if you don't have a reserve army of labor, you would not even have the kind of discipline which is required for any production system. Feudalism operates because people, ask yourself the question, what is the factor that actually makes people work? Feudalism operates because of the Monseigneur's whip. If somebody doesn't work, he's whipped. Capitalism is not based on explicit coercion. Then how is it that a capitalist system can at all operate? It operates because of the implicit coercion, that if you don't do the bidding of whatever, the foreman, if you kind of act slack on the workforce, out you go. You are thrown out of your employment, and consequently you join the reserve army of labor. So unless there is a reserve army of labor, maintaining full employment is something that would undermine the entire discipline on which the capitalist system is based, and consequently, as Marx has shown, full employment is impossible in a capitalist system.